4 radar systems, each worth roughly $300 million. And in less than a single day, they disappeared from the battlefield. Not destroyed in a massive air campaign, not wiped out by an overwhelming invasion force. Instead, they were carefully targeted in what may become one of the most studied military moves of the decade. A strategy designed to do one thing before anything else: blind the enemy. Because in modern warfare, the side that sees first usually wins first. In late February 2026, the Middle East entered one of the most dangerous escalations in decades. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran, targeting key military infrastructure across the country. Ballistic missile facilities were hit. Revolutionary Guard command centers were bombed. Senior commanders were eliminated. Within hours, the leadership structure of Iran AS security apparatus had been shaken by one of the most aggressive decapitation operations the region had ever seen. In Washington and Tel Aviv, early assessments suggested the operation had succeeded beyond expectations. The logic behind the strategy was straightforward: remove the leadership, disrupt the command structure, destroy missile facilities, and the Iranian system would collapse under the shock. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Iran did not collapse, it did not fracture, it did not reach for negotiations. Instead, the country launched a response that appeared calculated, disciplined, and, most importantly, prepared. Rather than unleashing chaotic retaliation, Iran began executing what looked like the opening phase of a much longer military plan. The targets of the first wave of missile strikes puzzled analysts at first. Missiles were not primarily aimed at cities, major air bases, or troop concentrations. They were aimed at something far more specific: radar systems. Across the Middle East, the United States operates a sophisticated network of missile defense infrastructure designed to detect and intercept incoming ballistic threats. At the heart of that system are advanced radar installations capable of tracking missile launches thousands of kilometers away. These radars feed real-time targeting data into interceptor systems such as THAAD and Patriot batteries, allowing them to calculate the trajectory of incoming missiles and attempt interception. Without that radar data, the defensive shield begins to weaken. Missile interceptors still exist, but their ability to respond becomes slower, less precise, and far less reliable. And within roughly 24 hours, several of the most important radar nodes in that regional network had been destroyed. For military planners, the implications of this were immediately clear. These were not random targets. They were the eyes of the system. Each of these radar installations represents years of development, highly specialized engineering, and extremely complex logistical deployment. They are not equipment that can simply be replaced in days or weeks. Manufacturing a single radar unit can take years. Deploying it requires massive infrastructure, integration with command networks, and highly trained personnel, which means that destroying them is not simply a tactical strike, it is a strategic disruption. And that raises a deeper question that is now being quietly debated inside military circles across the world. What if Iran's opening response was never about immediate retaliation? What if the missile strikes were designed as the first phase of a much larger plan? One aimed not at winning the first battle, but at reshaping the entire battlefield before the real conflict even begins. Because if you can blind the most advanced military network in the region, even partially, something important changes. Suddenly, the balance between offense and defense begins to shift. Missiles become harder to track. Interceptions become less certain, and the battlefield becomes far more unpredictable. Which brings us to the core of this story. Iran has spent decades preparing for the possibility of a direct confrontation with the United States, but it never planned to fight that war on America's terms. Instead, it built a doctrine designed around a very different idea. If you cannot match your opponent's strength, you find ways to dismantle the systems that make that strength possible. And according to many analysts, that is exactly what may have just happened. To understand why Iran targeted radar systems first, we have to step back and look at how this conflict actually began. The initial Western strikes were designed around a very specific strategic assumption. If you remove the leadership of a state, disrupt its command networks, and destroy its most visible military capabilities, the system that holds the state together begins to fracture. This approach has been used many times in modern warfare. It is often called a decapitation strategy. The goal is not just to destroy military targets. The goal is to break the enemy's ability to coordinate a response. When the strikes hit Iran, that strategy appeared to work. Key Revolutionary Guard facilities were bombed, missile infrastructure was damaged, senior commanders were killed. The political leadership of the country was thrown into sudden crisis. For a brief moment, it looked like Iran had been strategically stunned. But there is something important about Iran's military doctrine that many outside observers often overlook. For decades, Iranian planners have assumed that a first strike from a technologically superior adversary is almost inevitable in any direct conflict. which means their strategy was never built around preventing the first blow. Instead, it was built around surviving it. Iran EES military system is structured in a way that allows key capabilities to continue operating even if central leadership is disrupted. Command structures are decentralized. Missile units operate from dispersed and hardened launch sites. Mobile launchers can relocate quickly, making them difficult to target. In other words, Iran's military doctrine assumes that the opening phase of a war may involve absorbing severe damage. But the real strategy begins after that moment. When the first wave of Iranian missiles began to launch, analysts initially interpreted them as retaliation, a show of force intended to demonstrate that Iran could still respond. But when the target patterns became clear, the strikes began to look very different. Instead of focusing on maximum destruction, the missiles were aimed at extremely specific components of the American regional defense architecture, radar systems. These radar installations form the sensory network of missile defense across the Middle East. They detect launches, track incoming missiles, and provide targeting information to interceptor systems. Without them, the defensive shield begins to weaken. And if enough radar nodes are disabled, the defensive network becomes fragmented. Imagine trying to defend a region the size of the Middle East without the sensors that allow you to see incoming threats. That is the strategic effect Iran appears to have been pursuing. It is a concept well known in military planning circles, suppression of enemy air defenses, often abbreviated as SEAD. In traditional air warfare, SEAD operations involve destroying radar systems and surface-to-air missile sites so that aircraft can operate safely in hostile airspace. But Iran applied the same concept in reverse. Instead of clearing the skies for aircraft, it appears to have been clearing the battlefield for missiles. By targeting radar systems first, Iranian planners may have been attempting to degrade the early warning capabilities that give American defenses their edge. And if that interpretation is correct, it means the missile strikes we saw were not the main event. They were the preparation. Because once radar coverage begins to degrade, the dynamics of the battlefield change dramatically. Missiles become harder to track, interceptors have less time to react, and large-scale missile barrages become far more difficult to stop. This is where Iran's long-term investment in missile technology becomes critical. Over the past several decades, Tehran has built one of the largest missile arsenals in the world. Short-range ballistic missiles, medium-range systems, cruise missiles, and increasingly sophisticated drone platforms have all become central pillars of Iran's military strategy. These weapons were never designed to defeat American air power directly. Instead, they were designed to overwhelm the defensive systems that protect American bases and infrastructure across the region. And if the radar network that guides those defenses begins to weaken, even slightly, the balance between offense and defense begins to shift, which raises an unsettling possibility that many analysts are now considering. What if the radar strikes were only phase one? Because if the first phase of the conflict was about blinding the defensive network, the second phase could look very different. And that second phase may determine how far this war spreads, not just across the Middle East, but across the global economy that depends on stability in this region. If Iran's first objective was to weaken the defensive shield surrounding American forces in the region, the next phase of the conflict begins to look very different. Because once radar coverage begins to degrade, the battlefield opens in ways that were previously impossible. Across the Middle East, the United States maintains a vast network of military infrastructure. Air bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan form the backbone of American power projection in the region. These facilities host aircraft, logistics hubs, command centers, and missile defense batteries designed to protect both U.S. forces and regional allies. For decades, this network has allowed the United States to operate with overwhelming military superiority. But that superiority depends on something often invisible to the public: information dominance. American forces rely heavily on sensors, satellites, radar systems, and real-time data networks that allow commanders to see threats long before they arrive. Remove enough of those sensors, and that advantage begins to erode, which is why the radar strikes mattered so much. Without full radar coverage, detecting incoming ballistic missiles becomes significantly more difficult. Interceptors still exist, but their effectiveness depends heavily on early detection and accurate trajectory tracking. Missiles that slip through those detection windows suddenly become much harder to stop. And Iran possesses the kind of missile arsenal designed to exploit exactly that vulnerability. Unlike traditional air forces, which rely on expensive aircraft and trained pilots, missile forces operate very differently. Launch systems can be hidden in mountains, underground facilities, mobile trucks, or remote desert locations. They can fire quickly and relocate before counterstrikes arrive. Some launchers operate from hardened underground tunnels built specifically to survive air attacks. Others move constantly across road networks, making them difficult to track. In recent years, Iran has also integrated drones and cruise missiles into this strategy, adding new layers of complexity to regional defense systems. The result is a military force designed around saturation. Instead of relying on a few highly advanced weapons, the strategy involves launching large numbers of missiles and drones simultaneously from multiple directions. Even the most sophisticated air defense network can struggle under that kind of pressure. If radar coverage is reduced, the challenge becomes even greater. And that is why the destruction of those radar systems may represent more than just a tactical victory. It may represent the opening move in a much larger campaign. Reports have already indicated that multiple military installations across the region have been struck in the early phase of the conflict. Some attacks appear to have targeted infrastructure connected to American operations, while others have struck facilities linked to regional partners. Each successful strike sends a signal. The defensive shield is no longer impenetrable, and that realization has immediate consequences. For regional governments hosting American forces, the situation suddenly becomes far more complicated. Bases that once represented security guarantees can quickly become targets in a widening conflict. For military planners, every new missile launch forces difficult calculations. Which targets are priorities? Which systems must be protected first? How quickly can damaged defenses be restored? But beyond the military dimension, another layer of risk is emerging, one that extends far beyond the battlefield. Because the Persian Gulf is not only a military theater, it is also the center of the global energy system. Every day, millions of barrels of oil leave the Gulf through a narrow maritime corridor known as the Strait of Hormuz. Tankers carrying energy supplies for Asia, Europe, and beyond must pass through this choke point. And that passage lies directly within range of Iranian missiles, drones, naval forces, and sea mines. Which means that any conflict involving Iran carries a risk that extends far beyond military bases and defense systems. It carries the risk of disrupting the energy flows that power the global economy. And once energy markets begin to react, the consequences spread quickly. Oil prices rise, shipping costs surge, supply chains tighten. What begins as a regional military confrontation can rapidly evolve into a global economic crisis, which is why governments around the world are watching this conflict with growing concern. Because the next phase of the war may not be defined only by missiles and air defenses. It may be defined by something far more powerful, energy. And when energy becomes a weapon in a geopolitical conflict, the entire world feels the shockwaves. As the military confrontation expanded across the Middle East, another front of the conflict began to emerge, one that does not involve missiles or fighter jets. It involves oil. The Persian Gulf is one of the most strategically important regions in the global economy for a simple reason. A massive portion of the world's energy supply flows through a single narrow maritime passage, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, this corridor is only a few dozen kilometers wide. And every day, a huge share of the world's oil tankers pass through it. For decades, this choke point has been one of the most sensitive pressure points in global geopolitics. Any disruption there can ripple through global markets within hours. And when the conflict with Iran escalated, energy markets reacted immediately. Oil prices surged sharply. Traders around the world began recalculating risk. Insurance costs for tankers moving through the Gulf skyrocketed as shipping companies reassessed the dangers of operating in a potential war zone. Suddenly, the consequences of the conflict were no longer confined to military planners and defense analysts. They were being felt by financial markets, shipping companies, and governments across the globe. Because if the Strait of Hormuz becomes unsafe for tanker traffic, the impact spreads quickly. Energy supplies tighten, fuel prices rise, transportation costs increase, inflation begins to climb, and the shockwaves move far beyond the Middle East. For major energy importers in Asia, the stakes are particularly high. Countries like India, China, Japan, South Korea, and many Southeast Asian economies depend heavily on oil shipments from the Persian Gulf. Any sustained disruption forces governments to scramble for alternative supply routes, strategic reserves, or emergency economic measures. Even in Europe and North America, where energy supplies are more diversified, sudden spikes in oil prices still affect global markets. Airlines face rising fuel costs. Shipping companies pass higher transportation expenses down the supply chain. Consumers begin to feel the pressure at gas stations and in rising prices for goods. This is the hidden power of energy choke points. A single maritime corridor can influence the stability of the global economy, and Iran sits directly beside one of the most important choke points on Earth. For decades, Iranian military planning has incorporated this geographic reality into its strategic thinking. Iran cannot dominate the global economy, but it can threaten the artery through which a large part of the global energy system flows. This does not require closing the strait completely. Even limited disruptions can create uncertainty. Naval mines, missile strikes on tankers, drone attacks, or the simple perception of danger can slow traffic enough to disrupt global supply chains. Ships may hesitate to enter the region, insurance costs may become prohibitively expensive, and energy markets react immediately to uncertainty. That is why tensions around the Strait of Hormuz are always taken extremely seriously by global leaders, because what happens in that narrow stretch of water can influence economies on the other side of the planet. As the conflict intensifies, governments are watching closely for signs that the war might expand into this maritime domain. Naval forces from several countries are already operating in the region, monitoring shipping routes and attempting to ensure the safe passage of commercial vessels. But the situation remains extremely fragile. Every missile strike, every naval maneuver, every new escalation adds another layer of risk, which raises a difficult question for policymakers around the world. How do you contain a regional war when one of the participants sits beside the most critical energy choke point on Earth? Because if that choke point becomes part of the battlefield, the consequences will not remain regional, they will become global. And that is why the next moves by both sides may determine not just the outcome of a military confrontation, but the stability of the global economy itself. As the conflict moves into a more dangerous phase, one reality is becoming increasingly clear. This war is no longer just about missiles, radar systems, or military bases. It is about strategy and the dangerous gap between military power and strategic planning. When the United States and Israel launched their initial strikes, the goal was to deliver a decisive blow. By targeting leadership, missile infrastructure, and command networks, the operation aimed to remove Iran's ability to coordinate resistance. But modern states are rarely that fragile. Even after severe damage, a state can continue functioning if its core systems remain intact. Governments adapt, command structures reorganize. Military units operate independently, and nations that believe they're fighting for survival often become more determined, not less. That is one of the oldest lessons in warfare. Destroying leadership does not always destroy resolve, and Iran's response appears to reflect that reality. Rather than collapsing under pressure, the country shifted into a different operational mode. Its missile forces continued launching. Its military command structure reorganized quickly, and its strategy moved toward exploiting vulnerabilities across a much wider regional battlefield. The destruction of radar systems may have been only the opening move in that broader plan. Because once the defensive network weakens, new options begin to appear. Missile strikes can reach further. Infrastructure targets become more exposed, and the psychological impact of vulnerability begins to spread. Military alliances depend not only on weapons, but on confidence. Confidence that defenses will work. Confidence that escalation can be controlled. Confidence that adversaries will be deterred from taking the next step. When that confidence begins to erode, the strategic landscape becomes far more unstable. Regional allies of the United States now face a difficult reality. Many host American bases on their territory. Installations that serve as key nodes in Washington as military network across the Middle East. Those bases provide security guarantees, but they also make those countries potential targets in a conflict that may continue to expand. For governments across the Gulf, the balance between cooperation and exposure suddenly becomes more complicated. At the same time, global markets remain extremely sensitive to every new development. Energy traders are watching tanker traffic through the Persian Gulf. Investors are watching oil prices. Diplomats are watching for signs that the conflict could either escalate further or move toward negotiation. And military planners are watching something even more important: the next strategic move. Because wars rarely unfold according to the expectations that exist at the beginning. Initial victories can create new risks. Unexpected strategies can shift the balance of power. And technological advantages can be undermined when adversaries target the systems that support them. The destruction of several radar systems demonstrated how vulnerable even the most advanced military networks can become when their critical infrastructure is attacked. But the larger question now facing the world is not about radar. It is about escalation. Will the conflict remain limited to missile strikes and regional military targets? Or will it expand into a broader confrontation that pulls additional countries into the war? History offers many examples where conflicts that began as limited operations gradually spiraled into something much larger. That is the danger that analysts now worry about most. Because the Middle East sits at the intersection of global energy routes, major military alliances, and long-standing geopolitical rivalries, when instability spreads through such a region, the consequences rarely stay contained. They ripple outward through markets, diplomacy, and security systems around the world. And that is why the story of the $300 million radar systems matters far beyond the battlefield where they were destroyed. It represents a reminder of how modern warfare is evolving. Power is no longer defined only by the size of armies or the sophistication of weapons. It is increasingly defined by the ability to disrupt the networks that make those weapons effective. Blind the system, disrupt the defenses, change the battlefield. Because once the battlefield changes, the outcome of the conflict becomes far less predictable. And right now, one thing is certain: the opening moves of this war have already reshaped the strategic landscape of the Middle East. What happens next may determine whether that reshaping remains regional or becomes global.